I still remember that night like it just happened. My son dropped me off at a bus stop and told me to wait for a taxi. He said it so casually, as if it was nothing, as if leaving me there, alone, in the dark, made perfect sense. It was late, maybe past 10. The air was cold, the kind of cold that stings when it brushes against your cheeks. The lights along the road flickered one by one, and the silence between the cars felt too deep. I remember watching his car pull away, those red taillights fading into the distance, and thinking how strange it felt. He said he'd call a taxi for me, that I should wait, that he had something urgent to do. I didn't ask what it was. I just nodded. I wanted to believe he knew what he was doing. I stood there holding my purse tight, shifting my weight from one foot to another. There was a small convenience store across the street, half closed, with a man behind the counter counting bills. I went inside, mostly just to feel some warmth. The man didn't even look up when I walked in. That's when I saw the lottery stand. It was one of those cheap plastic racks filled with colorful tickets promising dreams. I hadn't bought a ticket in years. It felt silly, almost embarrassing. But standing there, half frozen, abandoned for reasons I couldn't quite understand, I just did it. I asked the man for one of those tickets, the kind with the red stripe and silver squares. He slid it across the counter without a word. I gave him $2, scratched it with my car key right there under the dim yellow light. The sound of the key scraping the paper was almost too loud in that small space. Nothing. No win. Just a few matching numbers that didn't mean anything. I sighed, crumpled the ticket, and was about to throw it away when I noticed the time on the clock behind the counter. 11:15. My son should have called by now. I stepped outside again. The street was empty except for a single bus passing by without stopping. The driver looked at me for a second, just one quick glance, before disappearing into the dark. Something inside me started to twist. It wasn't just the cold. It was that quiet kind of panic that sneaks in when you realize you might have been forgotten. I wanted to call my son, but then I remembered he'd taken my phone earlier that day, said he'd update something, some app I never used. I didn't think twice about it. Now I wished I had. I stood there a little longer, arms crossed, watching headlights appear and disappear. The world felt bigger than usual. I could hear a dog barking somewhere, and the buzz of the neon sign above the store made my ears ache. Then, for no reason I can explain, I went back inside and bought another ticket. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was something else. That small voice inside that whispers, "Do something. Just do something." This time, I didn't scratch it right away. I just held it, slipped it into my purse, and told myself it didn't matter. But it did. That ticket, that stupid piece of glossy paper, would change everything. I waited another 15 minutes before a taxi finally stopped. The driver rolled down his window and asked if I needed a ride. I hesitated. Part of me still expected my son to come back, but he didn't. So I got in. The taxi smelled like old coffee and pine-scented air freshener. I gave the driver my address, and he nodded. His eyes met mine in the rearview mirror for a second too long. I looked away. As we drove through the quiet streets, I kept thinking about my son, about the way he avoided eye contact when he dropped me off, about the strange tension that had been building between us for months, about the way his tone had changed lately. Soft words, but something cold behind them. When we got to my street, I saw that my house was dark. Usually there was at least one light on, but that night everything was black. I asked the driver to wait while I checked. He shrugged and started typing something on his phone. The front door was unlocked. My stomach tightened. I remembered locking it earlier. Inside, the air felt heavy, almost stale. I turned on the light in the hallway, half expecting to see someone there. But it was empty, just my coat on the rack, the faint smell of detergent. I turned back to the taxi, but it was gone. He'd driven off without waiting. I felt a wave of panic rise again, quick and sharp, then fade into a dull ache. I sat down on the couch and tried to make sense of everything. Maybe my son had gone somewhere important. Maybe he'd just been in a rush. But even as I thought it, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I found his message on the kitchen table, a folded note with my name on it. He'd written that he needed space, that things had been too much, that he was figuring things out. The words felt mechanical, detached. I didn't cry. I just sat there, reading it over and over until the letters blurred. Then I reached into my purse, pulled out that second lottery ticket, and started scratching. One number, then another, then the third. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. I checked the ticket again, rubbed my eyes, checked the date. Every number matched, every single one. I'd won. $50 million. For a few seconds, I just stared at it, frozen. My hands started to tremble. The room seemed to spin a little. I laughed, a small, broken sound that turned into something between a gasp and a sob. It didn't make sense. The night before, I was abandoned on the side of the road. Now I was holding more money than I could ever imagine. And yet, underneath all the shock, something darker was forming. A quiet realization that this wasn't just luck. This was a shift. Something had turned. Because deep down I already knew. This win wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something dangerous. I sat in silence for a long time, staring at that ticket. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The clock on the wall ticked so loud it felt like it was marking something I couldn't name. I kept expecting someone to knock on the door and tell me it was all a mistake. But it wasn't. I checked the numbers again online, and they matched perfectly. 50 million. I didn't even know what to do with a number like that. I felt dizzy. I thought about calling my son, but I didn't. Something inside told me not to. Instead, I made myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the blinds half open. The morning light looked cold, pale, almost gray. I watched the steam rise from the cup and tried to breathe slowly. The smell of burnt toast mixed with the faint scent of bleach from the night before. Everything felt off. The phone rang around noon. It was him. His voice sounded calm, almost too calm. He asked how I was, said he'd been thinking about me. There was something strange in the way he paused before every sentence, like he was measuring his words. I told him I was fine, that I was just home, doing nothing. He said he'd come by later to pick up some things. He didn't ask about the ticket, of course. How could he know? But I swear there was something in his tone that made my skin prickle. That soft, careful concern that didn't sound real anymore. When he arrived, he smiled, that polite, almost practiced smile. He said I looked tired. He touched my shoulder lightly, and for a moment I wanted to believe him, that he cared. But then his eyes drifted to the counter where the ticket still lay, half covered by a newspaper. He didn't say anything, just looked at it for a second too long. Then he asked if I'd been playing the lottery again. I told him yes, just for fun. He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. The rest of the visit was quiet. He walked around the house, touching things, opening drawers like he was just checking something. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, feeling that old mix of love and unease. There had been a time when he'd ask if I needed help with groceries, when he'd tell me about his plans, his friends, his job. But lately, he barely looked at me. When he left, he hugged me briefly. One of those hugs that doesn't feel like a hug at all. I stood by the window after he drove off, and I noticed his car didn't turn toward the highway. It stopped halfway down the street. He just sat there for a minute, engine running, before finally driving away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made me flinch. The fridge humming, the wind against the window, even my own heartbeat. I kept the ticket in a small jewelry box under the bed, like some secret I wasn't ready to share. The next morning, I went to the lottery office. The woman at the desk congratulated me in a flat voice, as if she'd said those words 100 times before. She told me the check would take a few days to process, that I should get a lawyer, maybe a financial advisor. Her tone was professional, but her eyes flicked toward the cameras twice. It made me nervous. When I walked out of that building, the air felt different, heavier. I noticed a man leaning against a silver car across the street. He was pretending to scroll on his phone, but when I looked at him, he turned away too quickly. By the time I got home, I'd convinced myself I was imagining things. Still, I locked every window, checked every door. I told myself it was just the shock, that everything would calm down once the money arrived. But it didn't. That evening, my son called again. This time, his voice sounded cheerful, too cheerful. He said he'd been thinking about taking me out for dinner, that we should celebrate something soon. I asked what he meant, and he said nothing, just laughed softly. That sound stayed with me long after the call ended. The next day, an envelope came in the mail. No return address. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. A photo of me standing outside the lottery office. Someone had taken it from across the street. The angle, the distance, it looked like the silver car had been there again. I stared at that photo until my hands went numb. My mind kept circling the same thought. Who would do this? And why? I didn't tell my son. I wanted to, but something deep inside warned me. The note he'd left, the strange distance in his voice, the way he looked at the ticket. It all started to weave together in ways I didn't want to admit. That night, I couldn't eat. I just sat by the kitchen window watching the street. Every passing car made my heart race. Around midnight, I saw headlights stop near my mailbox. Someone got out, looked around, then drove off. I didn't see the face, just the shape, the outline of a man. The next morning, I checked the mailbox again. Inside was another envelope, this one smaller. It contained nothing but a blank piece of paper. It wasn't until later, when I held it under the lamp, that I noticed faint marks pressed into the surface, like someone had written something on top of it before tearing the top page away. The only letters I could make out were, "Tell him." Tell who? I sat back, holding that paper like it was something alive. My mind went back to my son, to the way he'd dropped me off that night, told me to wait for a taxi. That tiny pause before he drove away. That unreadable look in his eyes. I didn't want to believe it, but it was there, whispering at the edge of every thought. What if he knew? What if he'd known from the start? I put the paper and the photo together in a drawer, locked it, and tried to breathe. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I just needed rest. But deep down, I knew something had already shifted. Something I couldn't undo. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a car door close outside. I turned off the light, held my breath, and waited. There were footsteps on the driveway. Slow, deliberate. Then, silence. When I finally dared to look out the window, there was nothing there. Just the empty street under the streetlight's pale glow. But when I checked the door in the morning, there were faint marks near the lock. Scratches, like someone had tried to open it. That was the moment I realized it wasn't imagination anymore. Someone was watching me. I didn't sleep that night, not really. Every sound felt too loud. The creak of the floor, the hum of the fridge, even the wind brushing against the shutters. By morning, my eyes burned. I went through the house slowly, checking every window, every door, touching the locks twice, 3 times. My hands were trembling, but I needed to feel control, even if it was fake. After coffee, I went outside. The air smelled like wet earth. The marks on the door were still there, tiny, sharp scratches near the keyhole. I touched them with my fingers, the cold metal biting my skin. Someone had tried to get in. I was sure of it now. Across the street, a car was parked, same silver color as before. No one inside, at least not that I could see. The windows were tinted, the sun glinting off the glass. I felt a weight in my chest, that heavy pressure that comes before panic. I went back inside, locked the door, and drew the curtains. I tried to distract myself, washed dishes, folded laundry, turned on the TV, but nothing worked. My thoughts kept circling back to my son, his voice on the phone, the strange calmness, the too long pauses, the way he looked at the lottery ticket. At noon, I called the lottery office again, pretending to ask about the paperwork. The woman said my claim was confirmed, that my check would be ready for pickup on Friday. 3 days. Just 3 more days, and I'd have it. After I hung up, I wrote the date down on a sticky note and stuck it on the fridge. Somehow, seeing it there made it feel real and terrifying. That afternoon, I went through my son's old room. He hadn't lived here for years, but some of his things were still in the closet. Old textbooks, a leather jacket, a shoebox filled with photos and receipts. I opened it, not really knowing what I was looking for. Most of it was harmless. Pictures from college, ticket stubs, little notes. But at the bottom of the box, there was something that didn't belong. A printed sheet, folded twice. It looked like an email. The words were faint, but I could still read them. It was addressed to someone named Dylan. It said, "She'll cash out soon. Just wait for my call. Don't mess this up." My stomach dropped. My throat went dry. For a long moment, I couldn't even breathe. I read it again, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that maybe it was part of some old prank or something unrelated. But deep down, I knew. I knew exactly what it meant. I folded the paper carefully, slipped it into my pocket, and sat on the edge of his bed. The sheet still smelled faintly like detergent and cologne. I remembered when he was small, how he used to crawl into my bed after a nightmare, whispering that he was scared. I'd hold him, promise him that no one could hurt him. Now it felt like those promises had turned inside out. That evening, I went to the grocery store just to get out of the house. The aisles felt too bright, too clean. I bought milk, bread, and batteries for the flashlight. When I turned to pay, I saw him. My son. Standing at the end of the aisle, pretending to look at a shelf of cereal. His expression was calm, almost blank. But his eyes, they were watching me. I froze. He noticed, smiled that same thin smile, and started walking toward me. My heart pounded so loud it hurt. I told myself to breathe, to stay normal. When he reached me, he said he just happened to be there, that it was funny running into me. He asked what I was doing. I told him I needed groceries. He nodded, looked into my cart, then asked if I'd been sleeping well. The question hit me like a knife. Too casual, too sharp underneath. I said yes, trying to sound steady. He looked at me for a long moment, then said he'd call later. He turned and walked away without another word. I watched him leave the store, the automatic doors closing behind him. When I finally paid and stepped outside, his car was parked across the lot. The same silver one. The engine was running. He didn't move. I drove home shaking. My fingers slipped on the steering wheel. I kept checking the mirror, convinced he was following me. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the dark living room with the curtains drawn, the jewelry box under my hands. Inside was the winning ticket, the only proof of what I now realized was a curse more than a miracle. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Do you still trust him?" No name, no signature. Just that one question. My heart thudded so hard I could barely see straight. I deleted it immediately, but it didn't matter. The words were burned into my mind. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, watching the shadows move across the walls. Every little sound outside made me flinch. By morning, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to sit here and wait. I needed to know how deep this went. I drove to the small bank downtown, the one where I used to keep my savings. I asked about opening a new account, something secure, private. The woman at the counter gave me a polite smile and handed me the forms. Her hands were covered in tiny ink stains, and for some reason, that detail stayed with me. How human it looked, how ordinary. When I left the bank, I saw the silver car again. parked a few spaces down. My pulse spiked. I walked faster, pretending not to notice. I unlocked my car, got in, and drove away. But as I looked in the mirror, I saw it pull out following. It stayed behind me for 3 blocks, then turned away. I didn't breathe until it was gone. When I got home, I locked every door again. Then I sat at the table and spread everything out: the ticket, the email printout, the photo, the blank letter. The pieces didn't fit yet, but I could feel the shape of something forming. Someone was watching me. Someone new. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't just my son. By morning, I'd made up my mind. Sitting around and waiting had only made things worse. I needed someone on my side, someone who could help me make sense of all this. I didn't trust the police, not yet. If my son really was involved, I couldn't risk them calling him. So I called a lawyer. A woman named Linda Cole. I found her name online the night before, written in a forum about financial fraud and inheritance issues. Her office was in a small brick building downtown. When I walked in, she greeted me with a steady smile. The kind of smile that didn't feel fake. She listened while I explained, slowly, carefully, without giving away everything. I told her I'd recently come into money and that someone close to me was acting strange. She didn't interrupt, just nodded, tapping her pen against a legal pad. When I finished, she said quietly that I needed to secure my assets immediately. Set up a trust. Make sure no one, not even family, had access to it. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were sharp. She'd seen this kind of thing before. When I left her office, I felt lighter for the first time in days. Like I'd taken a step forward, even if it was small. But that feeling didn't last. When I got home, the front door was slightly open, just an inch, but enough to make my heart race. I knew I'd locked it. I always did. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. Not at first. But when I went into the kitchen, I noticed the drawer under the sink was open. The one where I kept old bills and receipts. Everything inside had been shuffled. Not taken, just moved. It was like someone wanted me to know they'd been there. I closed the drawer, locked the door again, and sat down, trying to steady my breathing. I thought about calling Linda, but what would I even say? That someone had broken in but hadn't taken anything? Instead, I called my son. My hand shook as I held the phone. He answered after 2 rings. His voice was warm, too warm. He asked how I was, said he'd been meaning to stop by. I told him not to. I said I wasn't feeling well, that I needed rest. There was a pause, a long one. Then he said he understood, but his tone had changed. The calmness had cracks now. He asked if I'd talked to anyone lately. His words were careful, measured, but underneath there was tension, a kind of quiet anger. I told him no, I hadn't seen anyone. He said he'd call again tomorrow and hung up. After that, I sat there for a long time, my hand still holding the silent phone. That night, I heard footsteps outside again. Slow, heavy ones. They stopped near the porch, then turned away. I didn't look out the window this time. I just stayed still, barely breathing, until the sound faded. The next morning I went for a walk, something I hadn't done in weeks. I needed to think. The park near my house was empty, except for an older man feeding birds near the fountain. I sat on a bench, letting the sunlight hit my face. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful. Then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number again. He's getting desperate. No name, no context. I looked around, half expecting someone to be watching me, but the park was still. The old man didn't even glance my way. I saved the message this time. I didn't know who was sending them, but I wasn't going to delete it. Later that day, Linda called. She said she'd started the process of securing the funds, but I needed to come in and sign some documents. When I arrived, she had a folder ready. Thick paper, cold against my fingers. As I signed, she asked gently if I trusted the person who'd been acting strange. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "He's my son?" Her expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Pity, maybe? Or recognition. She told me to be careful. To change the locks, maybe even stay somewhere else for a few days. I nodded, but didn't tell her I didn't have anywhere else to go. When I got home that night, I noticed a car parked down the street again. The same silver one. I walked past it on purpose, pretending not to care. Inside, a man sat with his head turned slightly, pretending to look at his phone. My reflection passed over the window, and I felt his eyes move. I went inside, locked the door, and leaned against it until my legs stopped shaking. An hour later, my son called again. He sounded angry now, though he tried to hide it. He said he'd heard I'd been talking to people. I asked who told him that, and he said it didn't matter. He told me not to worry about anything, that he'd handle it. Handle what? His voice was tight, too tight. I could almost hear him clenching his jaw. Then, softer, he said he was only looking out for me, that I shouldn't make things harder than they already were. When he hung up, I just sat there, my hands numb. That night, I couldn't stay still. I packed a small bag, clothes, my ID, the ticket, the papers Linda gave me, and decided to leave. I didn't know where I'd go, maybe a motel, maybe a friend's house from years ago. Anywhere but here. But when I opened the door, there was an envelope on the step, my name written in shaky letters. Inside was a single photo. Me, sitting in Linda's office that morning. My breath caught. Someone was watching me everywhere I went. Someone knew everything, and if that someone wasn't my son, then he was working with whoever it was. I left that night. No plan, no destination. Just the need to move, to breathe somewhere that wasn't filled with fear. The house looked strange in the rearview mirror, quiet and hollow, like it was already part of another life. The roads were empty, lit by scattered streetlights. I drove without music, without thought, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The silence in the car pressed against me like a weight. After an hour, I pulled into a small roadside motel. The neon sign flickered. Half the letters dead. The man at the desk barely looked up as I paid cash for a room. His hands were stained with grease. His voice sounded like gravel. He handed me a key and said the coffee in the lobby was free until 6. The room smelled of cigarettes and cheap soap. I locked the door, set my bag on the bed, and sat on the edge, staring at the cracked wallpaper. My mind raced. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but the only person I could think of was Linda, and even that felt dangerous. I took out the ticket and the papers, spread them on the bed. They looked so small, so harmless, but I knew better now. That ticket had turned my life into something unrecognizable. I heard a car outside, tires on gravel. My heart jumped. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain just a little. A silver car, parked by the gas station across the road. I froze, watching the headlights reflect off the glass. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there, waiting. I turned off the lamp, sat on the floor by the bed, and stayed there for what felt like hours. When I finally looked again, the car was gone. By morning, I looked different in the mirror, my face pale, eyes shadowed. But under the exhaustion, something else had started to form. A quiet kind of anger. Not the wild kind, but cold and sharp. I drove into town after sunrise, found a small diner on the edge of a strip mall. The smell of bacon and burnt coffee hit me the second I walked in. A waitress with tired eyes asked if I wanted the breakfast special. I said yes, mostly because I needed time to think. While I ate, I noticed a man sitting 2 booths away. He wasn't eating, just sipping coffee and glancing at me from time to time. When I caught his eyes, he looked down too quickly. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. After I paid, I left through the back door, walked around the block, and watched from across the street. The man came out 5 minutes later, looking around before heading toward a car. The same silver one. I waited until he drove off before returning to my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. That was when I stopped being afraid. Somewhere between that diner and the highway, The fear hardened into something else. I wasn't going to keep running, not from my son, not from whoever he was working with. I drove to a small library 2 towns over. It was quiet, nearly empty. I used one of the public computers to search the name from the email I'd found, Dylan. There were dozens of results. Social media, articles, random names. But one caught my eye. A real estate broker connected to a company that handled cash transfers for lottery winners. I clicked the link. His photo loaded slowly, a man in his 30s with a too-perfect smile. My stomach turned. I'd seen that face before. He was in one of the pictures from my son's college graduation. I remembered now. He'd been a friend, maybe even a roommate. The kind who always hung around a little too long, who smiled too easily at everyone. I printed his company's address and left. My hands were cold on the steering wheel. Pieces were starting to come together, and the shape they made was ugly. I stopped by a hardware store before heading back to the motel. Bought a second lock for the door, a burner phone, and a small can of pepper spray. The cashier didn't ask questions. Back in the room, I texted Linda from the new phone, told her I needed to meet somewhere public, somewhere safe. She agreed. Noon, at a cafe near the courthouse. That night, I barely slept. Every few minutes I'd glance at the door, half expecting it to open. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps again. Slow, steady, stopping right outside my room. The doorknob rattled once, then silence. I sat there, holding the pepper spray tight in my hand, until dawn. At 10, I packed my things and left. The parking lot was empty, the air thick with humidity. I checked twice to make sure I wasn't being followed. The cafe was bright, full of morning chatter and clinking cups. Linda was already there, sitting by the window. She smiled when she saw me, but her face looked tense. I told her everything: the motel, the car, the man at the diner, the email. She listened without interrupting, her fingers tapping lightly against her cup. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and said we needed to go to the police. I told her I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I knew for sure. She hesitated, then leaned closer. If you don't feel safe, you need to disappear for a while, she said quietly. Not hide. Disappear. Her words stayed in my head all the way back to the car. I didn't go back to the motel. Instead, I drove out toward the lake, a place I hadn't visited in years. There was an old cabin there, half forgotten, where my husband and I used to spend summers. It was small, but it was quiet, and more importantly, no one knew about it. When I got there, the air smelled of pine and rain. The lock was rusty, but it still worked. Inside, dust covered everything, but it felt safe in a way nothing else had. I set my bag down, opened the windows, and stood there listening to the silence. For the first time in days, my heartbeat slowed. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the same woman who stood at that bus stop waiting for a taxi. Whatever this was, whatever my son had planned, I was going to find out. And this time, I wouldn't be the one running. The cabin felt like another world. The silence was thick, almost alive, broken only by the creak of the floorboards when I moved. I swept the dust, opened the windows wide, and let the air fill the place. For the first time in weeks, I could think clearly. I spread everything on the old wooden table: the lottery ticket, the photo, the strange messages, the email printout. One by one, I looked at each thing, trying to see what I'd missed. The name Dylan was the thread that kept pulling at me. My son and this man. There had to be more between them than I'd known. I powered on the burner phone and used the weak Wi-Fi signal from a nearby cabin. I searched deeper this time, cross-referencing Dylan's name with my son's. The results came faster than I expected. There it was. A business registration filed only 3 months ago. 2 names, Dylan Reeves and my son. A company listed under Consulting and Asset Recovery. My stomach turned. It was real. They'd planned something together. I read through the details, heart hammering. The company's mailing address matched the same one from Dylan's real estate page. And then I saw something else. A note about pending payments from a lottery transfer service. My name was listed as the client. I sat back, dizzy. They'd set up a company to move my winnings, before I'd even claimed them. The realization was like ice down my spine. I thought about the night my son dropped me off at that bus stop. How casual he'd been. How calm. It hadn't been an accident. He'd known I'd buy that ticket. He'd known somehow that I'd win. Or maybe he'd planned to get access no matter what happened. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady my breathing. The paper under my fingers felt rough and cold. For a moment, I wanted to scream, but instead I laughed, a low, bitter sound, because it was all so absurd. The son I'd raised, the boy I'd trusted, had turned me into prey. But not anymore. I spent the next few hours digging through every trace of their so-called company. Old listings, archived pages, forgotten files. I took photos with my phone, sent copies to a cloud drive under a fake name. Then I did something that felt strange but right. I called Linda. She answered on the second ring. I told her I was safe, but that I needed her to do something for me. Quietly. I gave her the company name and asked her to look into it. She didn't ask questions, just said she would. Before hanging up, she said softly, "You sound different." I didn't answer. That night, I cooked for the first time in weeks. Just eggs and toast, nothing special, but it felt grounding. The smell, the sound of the pan, the quiet routine. I ate slowly, listening to the lake outside, the faint rustle of leaves. But peace doesn't last long when someone's hunting you. Around midnight, I heard an engine in the distance. Headlights flashed between the trees, my whole body tensed. I moved to the window and crouched down. A car stopped at the end of the dirt road. Silver, of course. No one got out. The engine idled for a minute, then went silent. I turned off every light, sat on the floor, and waited. Minutes passed. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then a shadow moved near the porch, a shape too tall to be a branch, too still to be an animal. The steps creaked. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Then, silence. I stayed frozen until dawn. When I finally opened the door, there was no one there, just tire marks in the dirt and a small folded paper stuck between the boards of the porch. It said, "You can't hide forever." The handwriting was his, my son's. Something in me snapped then, not in fear, but in resolve. If he wanted me found, I'd make sure he was the one exposed. That morning I called Linda again and told her to meet me in person the next day. But before hanging up, I asked her to bring someone she trusted, someone from law enforcement, off the record. Then I started preparing. I printed every piece of evidence I had, packed it neatly in an old folder. The act of organizing it felt almost soothing, like stacking bricks in a wall between me and the past. At noon, I drove into town, to a small internet cafe where no one would know me. I made fake appointments using my son's name. One with Dylan's office, another with a loan service he'd recently applied to. Just enough to draw attention. If they were watching my activity, they'd panic. And panic made people make mistakes. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was already low. The light turned the water golden. I stood by the window, watching it shimmer, and for a brief second, I let myself breathe. I thought about when my son was little, how we used to fish at this very lake. He'd laugh when the line tangled, splash water at me until I laughed too. That boy, the one who once held my hand, he was gone. Maybe he'd been gone longer than I wanted to admit, but the man who'd replaced him, the one who thought he could manipulate me, didn't know who I was anymore. That night, I turned on the small lamp by the bed and wrote everything down, every detail. The times, the cars, the words. If something happened to me, someone would know. Then I placed the folder inside a metal tin and buried it near the old dock. The soil was cold, damp against my hands, but I kept digging until it was deep enough. As I covered it, I felt something shift inside me, the first real calm I'd felt in days. The next day, I'd confront him, but not like before. This time, he wouldn't see fear in my eyes. This time, he'd see himself for what he truly was. And when it was over, I'd have my life back, even if I had to burn everything else to get it. I barely slept that night. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, charged, like it was waiting for something to happen. I kept the lamp on and sat at the table, staring at the folder I'd packed, the proof of everything. By morning, fog covered the lake. It rolled across the water like smoke, swallowing the trees in silence. I made coffee, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. Today, I wasn't running. At 10, I left for town. The road was narrow, lined with wet leaves that stuck to the tires. Every turn felt sharp, every noise too close. I kept checking the mirror. Nothing. The cafe was quiet when I arrived. Linda was already there, wearing a gray coat, her hair pulled back tight. Beside her sat a man in plain clothes, tall, broad-shouldered, with the calm eyes of someone who'd seen worse things. She introduced him as Mark, a private investigator she trusted. I told them everything, from the bus stop to the break-ins to the buried folder by the lake. Mark took notes without interrupting. When I finished, he asked just one question. "Do you think he'll come for you?" I said yes. He nodded slowly, like he'd already expected that answer. "Then we'll let him." The plan was simple. I'd text my son, tell him I was ready to talk, that I wanted to meet him at the cabin, alone. Mark would be there, hidden nearby. If things went wrong, he'd step in. I agreed. Back at the cabin, the sky had turned gray. The air smelled like rain. I cleaned the table, folded a blanket, tried to make the place look normal. Then I sent the message. It didn't take long. My phone buzzed 10 minutes later. "I'll be there soon." My pulse quickened. I opened the window slightly, letting the damp air cool my skin. The lake was still, dark like glass. An hour passed. Then I heard it. The crunch of tires on the dirt road. I stepped back, my hands cold and dry. The car stopped, the engine cut off. Silence, then footsteps. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and stepped inside like he still lived there. My son. He looked tired, almost hollow. His smile was gone. His eyes scanned the room, sharp and restless. "You've been hiding," he said quietly. His tone was even, but something in it made my stomach tighten. I told him I needed time. He nodded, pretending to understand. But then his gaze drifted to the table, to the folder sitting there. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," he said. It wasn't a question. I stayed silent. He took a step closer. The air between us thickened. "You made this harder than it had to be," he said, voice low now, shaking slightly. "You could have trusted me." I almost laughed. Trusted him? The word felt meaningless. I told him I'd seen the papers, the company, the email, everything. His jaw tightened. For the first time, I saw something break in his face. He said Dylan had promised it would be easy, that I wouldn't even notice. Just a signature here, a transfer there. "You don't understand, Mom," he said. "It was supposed to help both of us." Both of us. The word stung. He stepped closer. I could see sweat on his temple, his hand twitching at his side. I told him to stop, that it was over. He shook his head, a sharp movement. "It's not over. You don't walk away with everything and leave me with nothing." His voice cracked on the last word. For a second, I saw the boy he used to be, scared, lost, but it disappeared fast, swallowed by anger. He lunged for the folder. I grabbed it first, pushing the chair between us. The sound of it scraping against the floor echoed through the room. He froze, breathing hard. "Don't do this," I said. My voice sounded steady, though I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. He stared at me, eyes wide, pupils dark, then suddenly laughed. "You think you can beat me?" he said, stepping closer again. "You can't even protect yourself." But I wasn't alone. From outside, I heard the faint crunch of boots. Mark. My son didn't notice, not until Mark's voice came from the doorway. "That's enough." My son spun around, startled. Mark stepped inside, his tone calm but firm. "You need to leave. Now." For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, my son reached into his jacket pocket. His hand came out, holding a small black object. Not a gun, but something worse in that moment. My phone. He threw it at the wall, shattering it, and shouted, "You ruined everything!" The sound tore through the room. Mark moved fast, stepping between us. My son pushed him, hard, but Mark didn't budge. The tension broke like glass. It was chaos, the sound of footsteps, shouts, the crash of the table tipping. My son tried to grab the folder again, but I held onto it. Paper tore, flying through the air like feathers. Then, suddenly, he stopped. His chest heaved, eyes flicking between us. For a long moment, the room was silent except for his breathing. He looked at me. Really looked. And I saw the fear in his eyes, the panic behind the anger. "You don't have to do this," I whispered. But he already knew he'd lost. He turned toward the door, then froze when he saw flashing lights through the trees. 2 police cars, their sirens muffled by the fog. Mark must have called them before he came. My son backed away, shaking his head. "You called them," he said. "You called them on me." I didn't answer. When the officer stepped inside, he didn't fight. He just stood there, staring at the floor, muttering something I couldn't hear. They let him out quietly, his hands behind his back. When the door closed, I felt my legs give out. I sank to the floor, the sound of rain beginning to tap against the windows. Linda came a few minutes later. She knelt beside me, her hand warm on my shoulder. "It's over," she said softly. But I wasn't sure it was. Not yet. I looked at the torn papers scattered around the room, the coffee mug knocked over, the streak of rainwater creeping across the floor. Something inside me felt hollow and alive at the same time. For so long I'd been afraid, of losing him, of being alone, of what I didn't understand. But sitting there in that wrecked cabin, I finally realized the truth. I hadn't lost him that night at the bus stop. I'd lost him long before that. And maybe now I could start finding myself again. The next morning, the world felt strange, too quiet, too clean. The rain had stopped, and thin light spilled through the windows, touching everything with that soft gray calm that only comes after a storm. The cabin looked like a battlefield. Papers scattered, the chair broken, the smell of coffee and damp wood hanging in the air. I stood in the middle of it all, trying to understand that it was finally over. Mark and Linda had stayed the night, making calls, giving statements. The police took my son away. They said there'd be an investigation, that Dylan had already fled the state. They found proof, bank transfers, fake documents, messages. It was all there. Everything I'd feared had been real. But now, so was the peace. When they left, the silence returned. I sat by the window and watched the lake shimmer under the morning sun. I felt empty but not broken, more like I'd been hollowed out to make room for something new. I stayed at the cabin for a few more days, cleaning up, thinking. I didn't cry. Not once. The tears had dried somewhere between the lies and the fear. What was left now was something steadier, quiet strength, a kind I hadn't known I still had. Linda came back 2 days later with a folder. She said the winnings were safe now, placed in a trust under my name, completely separate from anyone else. I signed the final documents. The pen felt cold between my fingers, but when the ink touched the paper, it was like closing a door behind me. She told me I could start fresh anywhere I wanted. A new town, a new home, a new life. For the first time in months, I smiled. When she left, I walked down to the dock. The air smelled of wet pine and sunlight. The water was calm, reflecting the sky. I dug up the tin I'd buried, the one with my notes, the photos, the copies of everything. I opened it and looked through the pages one last time. Then I tore them, piece by piece, and let the wind carry them away across the water. They spun and drifted, silver in the light, until they vanished. That night I slept deeply. No dreams, no sounds, just the rhythm of my own breathing and the soft rustle of leaves outside. In the morning I packed my bag. Before leaving, I wrote a short note and left it on the table. Just a few words. This was the last time I was afraid. Then I closed the door and didn't look back. I moved to a small coastal town 3 hours away. The kind of place where people say good morning to strangers and the ocean is always somewhere in the distance. I rented a modest house near the shore. White walls, blue shutters, a porch that smelled of salt and paint. The first weeks felt unreal. I'd walk to the market, buy fruit, listen to people laugh, and still half expect to see that silver car parked at the corner, but it never appeared. The fear began to fade. I started small, repainting the porch, planting flowers in the front yard. Each day felt like a quiet victory. The sound of waves became my clock. I'd wake with the sun, make coffee, sit outside, and watch the gulls drift by. Sometimes I'd think about him, my son, about what he'd done, and what had broken in him to make him that way. The anger would rise, but then it would soften into something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. A cold, distant kind. He was in prison now, waiting for trial. The news mentioned him once, briefly. They called it a case of financial exploitation within family. Clean words for something that had nearly destroyed me. Dylan was caught too. He'd tried to run, but they found him hiding in another state. When I read that, I felt nothing. Just quiet relief. Sometimes at night, I'd sit by the window, listening to the sea, and think about the bus stop. The beginning of all this. The cold wind, the flickering light, the sound of that first lottery ticket tearing. I could still feel the key scraping the paper the moment before everything changed. It felt like a lifetime ago. I didn't spend the money right away. I didn't even think of it that way anymore. It wasn't about money. It was about time, freedom, the chance to live on my own terms. I donated some quietly, to shelters, to small libraries, to places that gave people a way out. I bought books, new curtains, a second-hand piano I never learned to play. Little things, gentle things. Once I saw a young mother and her son walking by the shore. He was maybe 10, laughing, chasing the foam as it washed over his feet. She called out to him, her voice bright, warm. For a moment, something inside me ached, but it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. Because life still had beauty. It still had beginnings. I wasn't the same woman who stood trembling at that bus stop, or the one hiding in a dark cabin. I was someone else now, quieter, stronger, unshakable. Sometimes when the sun set and the sea turned red, I'd whisper to myself, "You made it." And I had. Months later, I received a letter. No return address, just my name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper. It was from him. My son. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness. That he'd been angry, lost, drowning in debts and pride. That Dylan had used him, promised him a way out, and he'd believed it. He said he was sorry. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe one day. But for now, silence was enough. I walked to the beach that evening. The air was cool, the sand soft under my feet. I watched the water move, calm, endless, and felt something inside me settle. The sky darkened slowly, the first stars appearing one by one. I thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the betrayal, the fight, and how, in the end, it all led me here. Not to fortune, not to revenge, but to peace, to myself. I stood there until the tide reached my toes, until the wind carried the last trace of the past away. Then I turned toward the lights of my small house, the sound of the sea still following me like a promise. And for the first time in a long time, I knew. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was free. Months passed before I heard the final word about my son's case. It came quietly, like everything else at the end of a storm. Linda called one afternoon while I was trimming the flowers in the yard. Her voice was calm, almost relieved. The court had sentenced him to 8 years in prison. Dylan got 12. The judge spoke about betrayal, manipulation, and greed, said they'd used trust as a weapon. The words sounded heavy even through the phone. I thanked her and hung up. I didn't feel joy, not even anger, just stillness. Later, I found the court summary online. My son had confessed everything: the forged documents, the fake consulting company, the plan to transfer the winnings to a joint account. He said he'd panicked when things went wrong. He blamed Dylan at first, then himself. I saw his picture in one of the articles. His face looked older, thinner, like all the arrogance had drained out of him. The same eyes, but empty. He'd asked for counseling in prison. He was working in the library there, reading, writing letters no one answered. Sometimes I think about that, about what happens when silence finally catches up with guilt. Maybe he'll learn, maybe he won't. Dylan, I read, tried to escape custody once. They caught him within a day. He'd lost everything: his license, his company, his name. Justice didn't come fast, but it came clean, quiet, precise, like a final breath before calm, and I never saw either of them again. Now, when I walk by the ocean and the air smells of salt and rain, I don't think about revenge or loss. I think about how endings can be merciful, and how sometimes the truest punishment is knowing you can never hurt someone again. Years later, I heard about him again, almost by accident. It was a small article buried deep in the local paper, just a few lines about a man released from prison after serving 6 years of an 8-year sentence. His name was there, printed small, like it didn't matter anymore. He'd been released early for good behavior. They said he was working in a warehouse outside the city, living in a rented room above a mechanic's shop. No family visits, no close friends, just quiet. I found myself reading that short article over and over, tracing his name with my finger. I didn't feel the old anger anymore, only a kind of distant sadness, the kind that comes from knowing a story is over, but the echoes still linger. From what Linda later told me, he'd tried to rebuild something. He'd gone back to school for a while, taking evening classes, mostly reading. People said he kept to himself, never talked about the case, never mentioned the lottery. But there were rumors, small, passing whispers, that he'd sometimes go to the old neighborhood, walk by the house we used to live in, stand by the fence for a while, and leave without knocking. No one ever saw him cry, but once a neighbor said he looked like he wanted to. Time moved on. The world forgot his name. One winter, years later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photo, just a simple shot of the lake, taken from the dock. On the back, a single line written in that same familiar hand: "I hope you found peace." I placed it inside a drawer and never replied. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, not out of grief, but as proof that even guilt can grow quiet. He lived his life in silence after that. And maybe that was his real sentence: to keep breathing in a world that no longer wanted to remember him. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no sounds, just the rhythm of my own breathing and the soft rustle of leaves outside. In the morning, I packed my bag. Before leaving, I wrote a short note and left it on the table. Just a few words. This was the last time I was afraid. Then I closed the door and didn't look back. I moved to a small coastal town 3 hours away. The kind of place where people say good morning to strangers and the ocean is always somewhere in the distance. I rented a modest house near the shore. White walls, blue shutters, a porch that smelled of salt and paint. The first weeks felt unreal. I'd walk to the market, buy fruit, listen to people laugh, and still half expect to see that silver car parked at the corner. But it never appeared. The fear began to fade. I started small, repainting the porch, planting flowers in the front yard. Each day felt like a quiet victory. The sound of waves became my clock. I'd wake with the sun, make coffee, sit outside, and watch the gulls drift by. Sometimes I'd think about him, my son, about what he'd done and what had broken in him to make him that way. The anger would rise, but then it would soften into something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. A cold, distant kind. He was in prison now, waiting for trial. The news mentioned him once, briefly. They called it a case of financial exploitation within family. Clean words for something that had nearly destroyed me. Dylan was caught too. He'd tried to run, but they found him hiding in another state. When I read that, I felt nothing, just quiet relief. Sometimes at night I'd sit by the window, listening to the sea and think about the bus stop. The beginning of all this. The cold wind, the flickering light, the sound of that first lottery ticket tearing. I could still feel the key scraping the paper, the moment before everything changed. It felt like a lifetime ago. I didn't spend the money right away. I didn't even think of it that way anymore. It wasn't about money. It was about time, freedom, the chance to live on my own terms. I donated some quietly, to shelters, to small libraries, to places that gave people a way out. I bought books, new curtains, a secondhand piano I never learned to play. Little things, gentle things. Once I saw a young mother and her son walking by the shore. He was maybe 10, laughing, chasing the foam as it washed over his feet. She called out to him, her voice bright, warm. For a moment, something inside me ached, but it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude, because life still had beauty, it still had beginnings. I wasn't the same woman who stood trembling at that bus stop, or the one hiding in a dark cabin. I was someone else now, quieter, stronger, unshakable. Sometimes when the sun set and the sea turned red, I'd whisper to myself, "You made it." And I had. Months later, I received a letter. No return address, just my name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper. It was from him, my son. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, that he'd been angry, lost, drowning in debts and pride, that Dylan had used him, promised him a way out, and he'd believed it. He said he was sorry. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe one day. But for now, silence was enough. I walked to the beach that evening. The air was cool, the sand soft under my feet. I watched the water move, calm, endless, and felt something inside me settle. The sky darkened slowly, the first stars appearing one by one. I thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the betrayal, the fight, and how, in the end, it all led me here. Not to fortune, not to revenge, but to peace. To myself. I stood there until the tide reached my toes, until the wind carried the last trace of the past away. Then I turned toward the lights of my small house, the sound of the sea still following me like a promise. And for the first time in a long time I knew I wasn't waiting anymore. I was free.